In the year 1518, the city of Strasbourg sat nestled along the banks of the river, ill like a creature holding its breath. The water moved slowly through the heart of the settlement, carrying with it the refuse of 10,000 lives. The whispered prayers of washerwomen and a distant echo of church bells that marked each passing hour. Timber-framed houses leaned toward one another across narrow cobblestone streets, their upper stories almost touching, as if the buildings themselves sought comfort in closeness. The great cathedral rose above everything else, a spire, a finger of red sandstone pointing toward a heaven that seemed, in those desperate days, impossibly far away. This was a city that belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, that vast and fractured dominion that stretched across the German lands and beyond. Strasbourg occupied a peculiar position within this sprawling realm, a free imperial city that answered to no local lord, but only to the distant emperor himself. The citizens took pride in this status, in the freedoms it afforded them, keys that governed their trades, and the council that managed their affairs. Yet freedom brought its own burdens, and in the summer of 1518, those burdens had grown almost too heavy to bear. The years leading up to that fateful season had been marked by suffering of every conceivable kind. Famine had stalked the region with terrible persistence, turning fertile fields into dust and filling the streets with hollow-eyed beggars who clutched at the sleeves of anyone who passed. The harvests had failed not once, but repeatedly, each bad year compounding the misery of the last until the price of bread climbed beyond what common laborers could afford. Mothers watched their children grow thin, while fathers worked themselves to exhaustion for wages that purchased less and less with each passing month. Disease followed hunger, as it always does, finding easy prey among the weakened and the desperate. Smallpox swept through the crowded quarters, where the poor huddled together for warmth, leaving behind pockmarked survivors and fresh graves in the churchyards. Syphilis, that strange new plague that had arrived from distant shores only decades before, continued its relentless spread through all levels of society. The physicians of the age understood little of how these afflictions moved from body to body, and their treatments often caused as much suffering as the diseases themselves. The summer heat that year arrived with unusual ferocity, pressing down upon the city like a great weight. The narrow streets trapped the warmth and held it close, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. The river ill grew, sluggish and foul-smelling, its waters too low to carry away the waste that accumulated along its banks. Flies gathered in humming clouds around the market stalls where butchers displayed their wares, and the stench of decay seemed to rise from every shadowed corner. Within the walls of Strasbourg, life continued despite the hardships, because life must always continue. Merchants opened their shops at dawn and haggled with customers until dusk. Craftsmen bent over their workbenches, producing the goods that would be sold in markets near and far. Women drew water from the public fountains and carried it home in heavy buckets balanced on aching shoulders. Children ran through the streets playing games that children have always played, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the general atmosphere of gloom. The people of this era lived with a relationship to suffering that might seem foreign to those of later centuries. Pain and loss were not anomalies to be explained away, but constant companions to be endured. Infant mortality claimed so many young lives that parents often waited years before giving their children permanent names, unwilling to become too attached to creatures who might be taken at any moment. Adults rarely lived past what we would consider middle age, their bodies worn out by labor and want, and the countless small infections that could prove fatal in a world without modern medicine. Religion provided the framework through which this suffering was understood and, in some measure, accepted. The Church taught that earthly life was merely a passage, a brief trial to be endured before the soul could claim its eternal reward. Suffering was not meaningless, but purposeful, a refinement of the spirit, a burning away of sin. The poor were promised that their patience would be rewarded in heaven, while the rich were warned that their comforts carried spiritual dangers of their own. Yet even the most devout could find their faith tested by the relentless accumulation of misfortune. In the streets of Strasbourg that summer, one could see it in the faces of the people, a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. They had prayed and fasted and made their confessions. They had carried candles in processions and placed coins in collection boxes. They had done everything the priests told them to do, and still the harvests failed. Still the diseases came. Still children died in their mothers' arms. The cathedral that dominated the city skyline served as a constant reminder of both heavenly promises and earthly power. Its construction had taken centuries, and its completion lay still in the future. But already it stood as one of the greatest achievements of human ambition in the region. Inside its vast interior, incense smoke rose toward vaulted ceilings that seemed to reach impossibly high. Stained glass windows transformed sunlight into rivers of color that spilled across stone floors, worn smooth by generations of shuffling feet. The common people entered this space with reverence and perhaps a touch of fear. Here the mysteries of faith were enacted in rituals whose Latin words most could not understand. Here the priests stood as intermediaries between mortal souls and divine power, dispensing sacraments and pronouncing judgments. The church offered comfort, certainly, but it also demanded obedience, and its authority extended into every corner of daily life. Beyond the cathedral, the city was organized into parishes and neighborhoods, each with its own character and concerns. The wealthiest citizens lived in substantial houses near the center of town, their windows glazed with precious glass, their tables set with pewter and silver. The craftsmen and shopkeepers occupied the middle ground, their homes doubling as their workplaces, their lives defined by the rhythms of their trades. And in the margins, in the crowded tenements and makeshift shelters along the city walls, lived those who owned nothing but their labor and often could not even sell that. The guilds that governed the various trades held enormous power in Strasbourg. These organizations controlled who could practice each craft, set standards for the quality of goods, and regulated the relationships between masters and apprentices. To be a member of a guild was to have a place in society, an identity that extended beyond the individual to encompass generations past and future. Those who fell outside the guild system existed in a kind of shadow world, vulnerable and unprotected. As July advanced and the heat intensified, the streets of Strasbourg took on a particular quality in the long evening hours. Families emerged from their stifling homes to seek whatever coolness might be found in the open air. Men gathered at taverns to drink the sour wine of the region and discuss the troubles that weighed upon everyone. Women sat in doorways, mending clothes or watching children, exchanging gossip and complaints in equal measure. In these gatherings, the conversation inevitably turned to the question of why. Why had God permitted such suffering to fall upon them? Why the rains had not come when they were needed? Why the grain had rotted in the fields while honest folk went hungry? Some blamed the Jews, as people in that era so often did, though few remained in Strasbourg after the persecutions of earlier centuries. Others whispered of witchcraft, of curses laid by envious neighbors or spurned lovers. The belief in supernatural forces permeated every aspect of life in this world. Angels and demons were not metaphors, but real beings who could intervene in human affairs. Saints watched over their devotees from heaven, ready to perform miracles for those who prayed with sufficient fervor. The devil prowled constantly, seeking souls to claim, working through human agents who had surrendered to his temptations. In such a cosmos, nothing happened by chance, and misfortune always had a cause that could, with enough effort, be identified and addressed. The river ill-wound through this landscape of belief and desperation, its waters reflecting the timbered houses and the cathedral spire. The bridges where merchants conducted their business, and the quays where boats unloaded their cargo. The river had shaped the city and continued to sustain it, providing water for drinking and washing, carrying goods to market, turning the wheels of mills that ground the precious grain into flour. Like the city itself, the river endured, flowing onward through good times and bad. No one walking those streets in the early days of July could have predicted what was about to unfold. The suffering they knew, the fears they harbored, the beliefs they clung to, all of these would soon combine in a manner no one had ever witnessed. Something was building in the heavy air, in the exhausted bodies, in the strained and desperate minds of the people. A breaking point approached. Though its nature remained hidden from all who moved through those narrow streets and knelt in those shadowed churches. The stage was set, though no one knew a performance was about to begin. The city waited in its ancient patience, its stones absorbing the summer heat, its people carrying on with the daily business of survival. Somewhere among them, a woman went about her ordinary tasks, unaware that she stood on the threshold of an extraordinary transformation. The calendar pages turned toward a date that would be remembered for centuries. A day when the boundary between the possible and the impossible would blur and bend and finally break entirely. In the churches, the priests continued their masses. In the markets, the vendors called out their wares. In the workshops, the craftsmen plied their trades. And the summer sun beat down upon them all, relentless and indifferent, as if preparing the ground for a harvest of madness that no one had planted and no one would be able to reap. The year 1518 was not yet half completed, but already it had taken its place among the hardest in living memory. What remained of it would prove harder still, in ways that defied all understanding and all explanation. The people of Strasbourg had learned to endure much, and they believed they understood the nature of their suffering. They were about to discover how wrong that belief could be, for the affliction that approached would not announce itself with the familiar signs of plague or famine. It would come instead as movement, as rhythm, as an irresistible compulsion that would seize the body and refuse to let go. It would come as dancing, though no one would call it celebration. It would come as a mystery that neither prayer nor medicine could solve, leaving in its wake questions that still echo through the corridors of history. The summer stretched ahead, full of heat and hardship, full of the ordinary miseries that the people of that age accepted as their portion. But the ordinary was about to end. In a matter of days, the streets of Strasbourg would become a stage for something no one had ever seen. It's a spectacle that would attract crowds of horrified onlookers and baffle the finest minds of the region. The dancing was coming, and with it would come a terror unlike any the city had known before. On the 14th day of July, in a narrow street not far from the river, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped out of her home and began to dance. There was no music playing, no festival being celebrated, no apparent reason for her to move in the way she did. Yet move she did, her feet striking the cobblestones in a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her body, somewhere beyond the reach of conscious thought. Her arms swung at her sides, her hips swayed, and her face wore an expression that those who witnessed it would later struggle to describe. Her husband watched from the doorway of their modest dwelling, confusion giving way to concern as the minutes stretched into an hour and his wife showed no sign of stopping. He called out to her, asked her what she was doing, begged her to come inside and rest. She did not answer, or rather, she could not answer, her breath coming too fast and her attention fixed on something he could not see. He approached her and took hold of her arm, trying to guide her back toward the house, but her body resisted his efforts, continuing to move even as he pulled against her. The neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion and the strange sight of a woman dancing alone in the street. They whispered among themselves, speculating about what might have caused this behavior. Some suggested she had received terrible news and lost her senses. Others wondered if she had quarreled with her husband and was expressing her anger through this bizarre display. A few made darker suggestions, speaking in low voices about possession and curses, about forces that could seize a person and bend them to purposes not their own. As the afternoon wore on and the summer sun beat down upon the street, Frau Troffea continued to dance, Sweat soaked through her clothing and ran down her face in rivulets that she made no effort to wipe away. Her breathing grew labored, her movements less coordinated, yet still she did not stop. Her husband brought her water, holding the cup to her lips while she danced, and she drank greedily before resuming her exertions with undiminished intensity. The crowd around her grew larger, people coming from neighboring streets to witness what was becoming the talk of the quarter. The identity of this woman has come down to us through the historical record, though little else about her life before that July day survives. She was the wife of a man whose occupation has been lost to time, a resident of Strasbourg like thousands of others, living a life that would have passed unremarked if not for what happened on that summer afternoon. We do not know her age, her appearance, whether she had children, or what hopes and fears occupied her mind. She enters history through the act of dancing and remains known to us only through that terrible distinction. When evening came and the light began to fade, Frau Troffea was still dancing. Her husband had exhausted his attempts to stop her and now sat nearby, watching helplessly as his wife's body continued its involuntary performance. The neighbors had mostly dispersed to their own homes and their own suppers, though a few lingered to observe what would happen when darkness fell. Would she finally stop when she could no longer see? Would exhaustion claim her at last and bring her dancing to an end? The night brought no relief. Frau Troffea danced on through the darkness, her figure barely visible in the moonlight that filtered between the close-set buildings. Her husband kept vigil beside her, dozing fitfully in a chair he had brought from inside, waking periodically to find her still moving, still trapped in that inexplicable rhythm. The sound of her footsteps on the cobblestones continued through the quiet hours, a percussion that those living nearby would remember for years afterward. By morning, word of the dancing woman had spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond. People came from across the city to see this marvel for themselves, to witness a woman who had danced without stopping for an entire day and night. They found her still moving, though her pace had slowed considerably and her movements had become shuffling and unsteady. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes rimmed with red, her clothing stained with sweat and the dust of the street. Yet still her feet moved, still her body swayed, still the dance continued. Her husband pleaded with the onlookers for help, for suggestions, for any intervention that might bring his wife's torment to an end. Some offered folk remedies, teas, and poultices that had worked for other ailments. Others recommended prayer, suggesting that a priest be summoned to bless the afflicted woman, or to determine whether demonic forces might be responsible. A few suggested more drastic measures, speaking of physical restraint or immersion in cold water. None of these proposals seemed adequate to the strangeness of the situation. A physician was eventually called, a learned man who examined Frau Troffea as best he could while she continued to move. He checked her pulse, which raced far faster than it should. He observed her breathing, which came in ragged gasps. He looked into her eyes and saw something that troubled him, a blankness or distance that suggested her mind was not fully present in her body. He prescribed rest, which was useless advice given that rest was precisely what she could not achieve. He recommended bloodletting, which was attempted without any apparent effect on her condition. The hours of the second day passed much as the first had passed, with Frau Troffea dancing and the crowd watching and her husband growing increasingly desperate. She had now been moving continuously for more than a day, a feat of endurance that seemed impossible for a human body to sustain. Yet, somehow, she continued, her reserves of energy apparently bottomless, her compulsion to move apparently unbreakable. Those who watched began to speak openly of supernatural causes. For what natural explanation could account for such a thing? The authorities of the city took notice as reports of the dancing woman reached their ears. This was no longer a private matter, a domestic peculiarity to be handled by family and neighbors. It had become a public spectacle, drawing crowds that disrupted the normal flow of commerce and daily life. Moreover, it raised troubling questions about what might be happening in their community. What forces might be at work? What threats might be gathering beneath the surface of ordinary existence? The council sent representatives to observe and report back on what they witnessed. These officials found a scene that confirmed the strangest of the rumors they had heard. Frau Troffea was indeed dancing, had indeed been dancing for days, showed no sign of being able to stop. Her condition had deteriorated visibly, her body showing the effects of sustained exertion without proper rest or nourishment. She stumbled frequently now, catching herself and continuing to move, her dance becoming more of a stagger, but a stagger that maintained its rhythm nonetheless. The officials watched for a time, consulted with one another in low voices, and departed to make their report. Back in the council chambers, the debate began over how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Some argued that the woman should be confined, removed from public view, where she could dance herself out without causing further disruption. Others suggested that she should be taken to a church, placed before the altar, where the presence of the sacred might break whatever curse had seized her. Still others recommended patience, arguing that the dancing must eventually stop on its own, that the human body simply could not continue indefinitely regardless of what forces might be driving it. While the authorities deliberated, Frau Troffea danced on. The third day came and went, then the fourth. Her shoes had worn through, and her feet now bled onto the cobblestones, leaving red traces wherever she moved. Her husband had stopped trying to feed her, for she could not coordinate the actions of chewing and swallowing while her body continued its relentless motion. He gave her water when he could, but even this simple act had become difficult. He had aged visibly in those few days, the lines on his face deepening, his eyes taking on a haunted quality. The crowd that gathered around her had evolved as well. The initial curiosity seekers had been replaced by a different sort of observer, people who came not to marvel, but to pray, to weep, to witness what they believed might be a manifestation of divine or demonic power. Some knelt on the cobblestones and recited rosaries, their beads clicking softly as they implored heaven for mercy. Others brought offerings, candles, and flowers in small coins, laying them at the edge of the space where Frau Troffea danced, as if she were a saint or a shrine rather than a suffering woman. The priests of the local parish came to observe and to offer what spiritual assistance they could. They spoke prayers over the dancing woman, made the sign of the cross, sprinkled holy water on her moving form. These interventions produced no visible effect, though the clergy assured onlookers that spiritual battles were not always won quickly or obviously. They promised to pray for her deliverance, to include her in the masses said at the parish church, to petition the saints who were known to have power over such afflictions. By the end of the first week, Frau Troffea had become the most famous person in Strasbourg, though she could take no pleasure or even awareness of her notoriety. She had been dancing continuously for 7 days, a duration that seemed to exceed the limits of human possibility. Her body had wasted visibly, the flesh falling away from her bones, her face becoming gaunt and skull-like. Her movements had slowed to a fraction of their original speed, yet they did not cease. She shuffled and swayed, her feet barely leaving the ground, her arms hanging limp, but still she moved. The question that hung over the city was whether she would survive. Many expected her to collapse at any moment, her heart giving out or her body simply shutting down from exhaustion. Some even hoped for this outcome, seeing death as a mercy compared to the endless torment she was enduring. Others prayed for a miraculous recovery, for the curse to lift, and the woman to be restored to her husband and her life. The uncertainty created an atmosphere of tension that pervaded the entire community. What no one yet realized was that Frau Troffea was only the beginning. She had been the first to dance, but she would not be the last. Even as the city focused its attention on her solitary affliction, the seeds of something far larger were taking root. Within days, others would begin to show the same symptoms, their bodies seized by the same inexplicable compulsion. What had seemed like a singular tragedy, a personal catastrophe that might be contained and eventually forgotten, was about to reveal itself as something much more terrible. The summer heat continued, unabated, pressing down on the city with suffocating weight. The river Ill flowed sluggishly past the watching crowds, carrying away whatever refuse found its way into its waters. The great cathedral cast its shadow over the streets as the sun moved across the sky, marking the passage of hours that brought no relief to the dancing woman. Somewhere in the chambers where power resided, the authorities continued their debates, sticking a response to a situation that had no precedent in their experience. And Frau Troffea danced on, her body a battleground between will and compulsion, her suffering a spectacle for all who cared to witness it. She had become something more than a woman, had been transformed by her affliction into a symbol of everything the people of Strasbourg feared and could not understand. She danced at the boundary between the explicable and the inexplicable, between the natural and the supernatural, between the ordered world they thought they knew and the chaotic forces that lurked beneath its surface. Her dance would continue, and soon it would spread, and the city would learn that there are forms of suffering that defy all remedy and all reason. The affliction that had seized Frau Troffea did not remain hers alone. Like a flame that leaps from one dry timber to the next, the compulsion to dance spread outward through the streets of Strasbourg with a speed that defied all natural explanation. What had begun as the strange torment of a single woman became, in the span of days, a phenomenon that gripped dozens of souls and showed no sign of stopping. The city watched in mounting horror as the number of dancers grew, each new case confirming that something unprecedented and terrible had taken root among them. By the final week of July, 34 people had joined the terrible dance. They moved through the streets in scattered groups, their bodies contorting to rhythms that only they could hear. Some shuffled in tight circles, their arms hanging limp at their sides. Others leaped and spun with a frantic energy that seemed impossible to sustain, their faces twisted into expressions that hovered somewhere between ecstasy and agony. The cobblestones echoed with the slap of feet against stone, a percussion that never ceased, not even when the sun set and the city fell into darkness. The afflicted came from all corners of the community, though most were women and most were poor. Servants abandoned their duties to dance in the marketplace. Wives left their cooking fires burning as they stumbled out of their homes, their bodies already moving to that invisible music. A few men joined their ranks as well, laborers and craftsmen who had seemed perfectly ordinary until the moment when their limbs began to jerk and twist beyond their control. No pattern emerged that might explain who would be seized next, and this randomness only deepened the terror. Among those who watched, the question of contagion hung heavy in the air. Plague, they understood, the way sickness could pass from one body to another through means both visible and mysterious. But this was no ordinary plague, and its method of transmission seemed to follow no rules that physicians or priests could identify. Some of the dancers had been present when Frau Troffea first began her ordeal, but others had never seen her at all. Some lived in the same neighborhood, but others came from distant quarters of the city. The affliction chose its victims according to a logic that remained stubbornly hidden. The guild masters of Strasbourg gathered in their meeting halls to discuss what they were witnessing. These were practical men, accustomed to solving problems through organization and effort. They managed the economic life of the city, regulated the quality of goods, settled disputes between craftsmen and customers. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for a crisis of this nature. They spoke in low voices, their faces grave, struggling to find some framework that might contain what was happening. Some suggested that the dancing must be a form of possession, that demons had entered the bodies of the afflicted and were forcing them to perform these unholy movements. This explanation had the virtue of familiarity, for tales of demonic possession circulated widely in that era. The church taught that the devil and his servants constantly sought opportunities to claim human souls, and physical torment was among their favorite methods. Perhaps some collective sin had opened a door through which these evil spirits had poured. Others proposed that the dancing might be a form of protest, a deliberate performance by people who wished to draw attention to their suffering. The poor had few means of making their voices heard, and desperation could drive people to extreme measures. Perhaps these dancers had chosen their affliction, had willed themselves into these contortions as a way of forcing the authorities to acknowledge the depth of their misery. This theory offered the comfort of human agency, the notion that the dancers could stop if they truly wished to. But those who had observed the afflicted closely found this explanation impossible to accept. The dancing showed none of the characteristics of deliberate performance. The movements were too violent, too sustained, too obviously painful. The dancers wept as they spun. They called out for help as their legs carried them onward. They collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again within minutes, their bodies responding to a command that their conscious minds could not override. No one would choose such torment, not for any cause, not for any grievance. The merchants who conducted business in the city squares found their commerce disrupted by the spectacle. Its customers who came to buy cloth or spices or metalwork found themselves instead transfixed by the sight of dancers weaving between the market stalls. Some watched with the morbid fascination, unable to look away from this display of human suffering. Others fled in terror, convinced that merely witnessing the dance might somehow cause them to join it. The normal rhythms of trade ground to a halt as the abnormal rhythms of the affliction took center stage. In the churches and chapels scattered throughout Strasbourg, the clergy wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. They had comforted the sick and blessed the dying through countless epidemics. They had prayed for rain during droughts and given thanks for abundant harvests. Their role in times of crisis was clear and well established. But this dancing plague fell outside the familiar categories of affliction, and they found themselves uncertain how to respond. Some priests urged their congregations to pray for the dancers, to storm heaven with petitions for their deliverance. If demons were responsible, then prayer was the appropriate weapon. If divine punishment had fallen upon the city for its sins, then repentance and supplication might lift the curse. The faithful knelt in their pews and recited the familiar words, their voices rising in unison, while outside the windows the dancers continued their endless movement. Other members of the clergy wondered if the affliction might be a test, a trial sent by God to measure the faith and charity of the community. How would Strasbourg respond to these suffering souls? Would the healthy reach out to help the afflicted, or would they turn away in fear and disgust? The answers to these questions might determine whether the plague spread further or finally came to an end. In this interpretation, the dancers themselves were less important than the reactions they provoked in everyone else. The city council convened an emergency session, the members gathering in the stone chamber where they normally debated matters of taxation and trade. These men represented the wealthiest and most powerful families of Strasbourg, and they were accustomed to being in control. They had navigated the city through wars and famines, through epidemics and economic downturns. They had always found solutions, had always restored order when chaos threatened. Now they faced a challenge unlike any in their experience. The council chamber filled with the sound of raised voices as different factions advocated different approaches. Some called for the dancers to be confined, locked away in buildings where they could not spread their affliction to others. The sight of them in the streets was causing panic, was disrupting business, was making Strasbourg a spectacle of ridicule for the surrounding region. Whatever the cause of their condition, the immediate priority must be to contain the damage. Others argued that confinement would be cruel and possibly counterproductive. The dancers were citizens of Strasbourg, entitled to the protection of the city. They were suffering an affliction they had not chosen and could not control. To treat them as criminals or madmen would compound their misery and might bring divine disfavor upon the entire community. Compassion demanded a gentler approach, even if the practical benefits remained unclear. The physicians of the city were summoned to offer their professional opinions. These learned men had studied the ancient texts, had observed the workings of the human body through years of practice. They spoke of humors and temperaments, of the balance of heat and cold, moisture and dryness that governed health and disease. They examined the dancers with clinical detachment, noting their elevated pulses, their flushed skin, their apparent insensibility to pain or fatigue. Several physicians proposed that the dancing represented an excess of hot blood, a condition that could be treated through the standard remedy of bloodletting. Open a vein, drain away the corrupted fluid, and the patient should return to normal. This theory had the advantage of offering a concrete intervention, something that could be done while everyone waited for divine mercy to manifest. Some of the dancers were indeed bled, their arms opened with practiced precision, their blood collected in ceramic bowls. The treatment accomplished nothing. The bled dancers continued to dance, their movements perhaps slightly weaker, but no less compulsive. If anything, the loss of blood made their condition more pitiable, as they now staggered and stumbled, where before they had leaped and spun. The physicians retreated to consult their texts once more, searching for some passage that might illuminate what they were witnessing. Among the common people of Strasbourg, fear spread even faster than the dancing itself. Neighbors looked at neighbors with new suspicion, wondering who might be the next to succumb. Parents kept their children indoors, away from the streets where the dancers moved. Friendships strained as people withdrew into their homes, unwilling to risk exposure to whatever invisible force was claiming victims. The social fabric that held the community together began to fray under the pressure. Rumors proliferated in the absence of reliable information. Some claimed that the dancing had been caused by a curse laid upon the city by a witch who had been wrongly accused and punished. Others whispered that the dancers had eaten contaminated food, bread baked with tainted grain that had poisoned their minds and bodies. Still others suggested that a strange alignment of the stars had created conditions favorable to such outbreaks, that the heavens themselves had ordained this suffering. The spectacle drew observers from beyond the city walls. Travelers who passed through Strasbourg carried tales of what they had seen to villages and towns throughout the region. Curiosity seekers made special journeys to witness the dancing for themselves, treating the affliction as a kind of entertainment. They stood at safe distances, pointing and commenting as if the dancers were performers rather than sufferers. This attention brought shame to the city fathers, who saw their community becoming famous for all the wrong reasons. As July drew to a close, the situation showed no sign of improvement. The original dancers continued their torment, their bodies growing visibly weaker, even as the compulsion remained undiminished. New cases appeared each day, sometimes one or two, sometimes half a dozen at once. The total number climbed steadily, passing 40, approaching 50, with no ceiling in sight. The council met again and again, debating the same proposals, reaching the same impasses. The summer heat persisted, baking the streets and buildings, making the air difficult to breathe. The dancers sweated through their clothes, their skin glistening in the harsh sunlight. Some wore through the soles of their shoes and continued dancing on bleeding feet. The sound of their movement became a constant background noise, audible from blocks away, impossible to escape. It wove itself into the dreams of those who tried to sleep, a rhythm that would not be silenced. In the churches, the prayers grew more fervent and more desperate. The faithful bargained with God, promising pilgrimages and donations if only this affliction would end. They confessed sins both real and imagined, hoping to identify whatever offense had brought this punishment upon them. They touched relics and drank holy water, seeking any source of protection against the invisible enemy that moved among them. The dancers themselves, when they could speak at all, offered no explanations. They seemed as confused as everyone else, as horrified by their own movements. They begged for rest, for water, for someone to make it stop. Their voices grew hoarse from crying out, then fell silent, as exhaustion claimed even the power of speech. But their bodies kept moving, step after step, turn after turn, as if some external force had seized the reins and would not let go. The city of Strasbourg had faced many trials in its long history, i.e., it had survived sieges and floods, plagues and fires, i.e., its people had rebuilt after every disaster, had found ways to carry on when carrying on seemed impossible. But this dancing plague presented a different kind of challenge, one that attacked the very notion of human autonomy and rational order. If the body could rebel against the mind so completely, if dozens of people could be seized by the same inexplicable compulsion, then what certainties remained? The foundations of ordinary life trembled, and no one could say when or whether they would stabilize again. The City Council of Strasbourg, having exhausted their initial debates and consultations, finally arrived at a decision that would echo through the centuries as one of the most remarkable responses to a medical crisis ever recorded. They determined that the afflicted must be encouraged to dance, that the fever burning through their bodies could only be expelled through vigorous and sustained movement. What the dancers needed, the authorities concluded, was not rest, but more dancing, conducted under proper supervision and with appropriate musical accompaniment. This logic, strange as it may appear to later generations, followed a certain internal consistency rooted in the medical theories of the age. The physicians who advised the council believed that the dancing represented an attempt by the body to purge itself of corrupt humors. The afflicted had been seized by an excess of hot blood that demanded release through physical exertion. To interrupt the dancing prematurely would be to trap this dangerous substance within the body, where it might cause even greater harm. It's better to let the fever run its course, to encourage the purging process until the corruption had been fully expelled. There was also a belief, widely held among the learned men of that era, that certain conditions could only be cured through their own intensification. A poison might be drawn out by applying more of the same substance to the wound. A fever might break more quickly if the patient was wrapped in blankets and made to sweat. The body possessed its own wisdom, its own healing mechanisms, and the role of the physician was sometimes simply to support what nature had already begun. The dancing, in this view, was not the disease, but the cure, and the task of the authorities was to facilitate it. Armed with this understanding, the council issued orders that would transform the crisis into something even more extraordinary. Carpenters were summoned and set to work constructing wooden platforms in 2 of the city's public spaces, stages upon which the dancers could perform their involuntary movements without obstruction. The cramped and cluttered streets had proven dangerous, as dancers collided with carts and stumbled over refuse. These new platforms would provide clear, level surfaces where the afflicted could dance freely and safely. Musicians were hired to provide accompaniment, their fees paid from the public treasury. Drums and pipes and stringed instruments were gathered, and the players were instructed to maintain a steady rhythm throughout the daylight hours. The theory held that proper music would regulate the chaotic movements of the dancers, would channel their compulsion into more structured patterns that might hasten the purging of their corrupted blood. The sound of these instruments soon filled the streets, a constant backdrop to the spectacle unfolding on the stages. Professional dancers were recruited as well, men and women who earned their living through performance at festivals and celebrations. These skilled practitioners were asked to dance alongside the afflicted, to demonstrate proper technique, to guide the sufferers through movements that might accelerate their recovery. It was hoped that the presence of these experts would somehow organize the chaos, would impose a form upon what had been formless, and in doing so would help bring the episode to a swifter conclusion. The Guild of Grain Merchants contributed funds to support this effort, as did several of the wealthier families whose sense of civic duty outweighed their personal discomfort. Temporary shelters were erected near the stages to provide shade for those who collapsed from exhaustion. Barrels of water and wine were placed within easy reach so that the dancers might refresh themselves without having to stop. Food was made available as well: bread and cheese and dried fruit that could be consumed quickly during brief pauses in the dancing. The response of the dancers themselves to these arrangements varied considerably. Some seemed to take comfort in the music, their movements becoming slightly more coordinated as they followed the rhythm provided by the hired musicians. Others showed no response at all, continuing their wild and erratic motions as if the instruments were silent. A few appeared to grow even more agitated, their dancing intensifying to dangerous levels as the drums beat their steady pulse. The professional dancers who had been engaged to help quickly found themselves overwhelmed by the nature of their task. They had expected to guide and instruct, to lead the afflicted through steps and figures that might bring order to chaos. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by people whose movements followed no pattern they could recognize, as bodies contorted in ways that no training could explain. Some of the hired dancers withdrew in fear, convinced that proximity to the afflicted might cause them to succumb to the same compulsion. Crowds gathered around the stages, larger crowds than had assembled anywhere in the city for years. The spectacle drew observers from every level of society, from wealthy merchants in their fine clothes to beggars in their rags. They stood in clusters, watching the dancers writhe and spin, listening to the music that never stopped, commenting to one another on what they were witnessing. For some, the scene held a terrible fascination, impossible to look away from despite the obvious suffering on display. Children climbed onto the shoulders of their parents to get a better view. Vendors appeared at the edges of the crowd, selling refreshments to those who had come to watch. The atmosphere took on a quality that hovered uneasily between carnival and catastrophe. People laughed nervously, pointed at particular dancers, made wagers on how long individuals could continue before collapsing. The suffering of the afflicted became, for a time, a form of public entertainment. But the entertainment value faded quickly as the true nature of the situation became apparent. The dancers were not performing for the amusement of the crowd. They were suffering, visibly and horribly, their faces contorted with exhaustion and pain. Their feet bled onto the wooden platforms, leaving dark stains that spread as the hours passed. Their cries for help, when they could still manage to produce them, cut through the sound of the music with raw desperation. The strategy of encouraging the dancing was not working. Far from burning out the fever, the sustained exertion seemed only to spread it further. New cases continued to appear, the count climbing past 60, then 70, then approaching 100. Some of those who had danced the longest began to show signs of serious physical deterioration. Their hearts raced at dangerous speeds. Their breathing grew labored and irregular. The physicians who observed them expressed growing concern that the treatment might be killing the very people it was meant to save. Reports began to circulate of dancers who had collapsed and failed to rise again. The exact circumstances of these deaths remained unclear, obscured by the chaos and confusion that surrounded the stages. Some appeared to have succumbed to simple exhaustion, their bodies finally giving out after days of continuous movement. Others showed signs of stroke or heart failure, the strain of unceasing exertion proving too much for organs already weakened by malnutrition and disease. The plague had claimed its first fatalities. The deaths changed the character of the crisis fundamentally. What had been strange and disturbing now became terrifying. The crowds that had gathered to watch began to thin, as people realized that they were witnessing not a curiosity, but a catastrophe. Parents who had brought their children to see the spectacle hurried them away, fearful of exposing young minds to such scenes of suffering and death. The laughter and wagers ceased, replaced by prayers and expressions of horror. The authorities, who had ordered the construction of the stages and the hiring of the musicians, found themselves facing harsh criticism. Their intervention had not solved the problem, but had seemingly made it worse. The number of dancers continued to grow. The death toll continued to climb. The city's reputation suffered with each passing day, as travelers carried tales of the failed treatment to every corner of the region. Strasbourg was becoming known not only for its strange plague, but for the folly of its response. Within the council chambers, recriminations flew as different factions blamed one another for the disaster. Those who had advocated for the dancing cure now found themselves defending positions that seemed increasingly indefensible. Those who had expressed doubts from the beginning took little satisfaction in having been proven right, for the suffering continued regardless of who claimed credit or blame. The unity that the crisis had initially produced gave way to bitter divisions. The musicians continued to play, for no one had thought to tell them to stop. The stages remained standing, their wooden surfaces stained with blood and worn smooth by countless shuffling feet. The professional dancers had largely abandoned their posts, leaving only the afflicted to continue their terrible performance. The barrels of water and wine ran dry and were not immediately refilled. As the organizational structure that had supported the intervention began to break down, among the dancers themselves, a kind of hierarchy had emerged based on the duration of their affliction. Those who had been dancing the longest occupied the central positions on the stages, their movements reduced to shuffling steps and weak arm gestures. Newer victims displayed more energy, their bodies not yet depleted by days of continuous exertion. But all of them shared the same trapped expression, the same desperate awareness that they could not stop, could not rest, could not escape the compulsion that had seized them. The families of the afflicted faced impossible choices. They could stay near the stages, watching their loved ones suffer, trying to provide what comfort and support the circumstances allowed. Or they could retreat to their homes, attempting to maintain some semblance of normal life, while a husband or wife or child danced toward possible death. Some families kept vigil day and night, refusing to abandon their afflicted members. Others found the spectacle too painful to witness and stayed away, consumed by guilt and grief in equal measure. The clergy, who had been uncertain how to respond, now faced even greater pressure to provide answers. If the dancing was divine punishment, then surely God would provide some indication of what sins had provoked such a response. If it was demonic possession, then the rituals of exorcism should have some effect. But neither theological framework seemed adequate to explain what was happening, and the priests found themselves as confused and frightened as everyone else. As the first week of August began, the city of Strasbourg had been transformed by the crisis. The stages stood as monuments to a failed intervention, still hosting their unwilling performers, still surrounded by the remnants of the support infrastructure that had been constructed with such hope and determination. The music continued to play, though with less vigor than before. The musicians themselves growing weary of their endless task, and the dancers kept dancing, some weakening, some dying, but none recovering through the method that had been prescribed for their cure. The authorities faced a moment of reckoning. Their confident intervention had produced results opposite to what they had intended. The theory that had guided their actions lay in ruins, contradicted by the evidence of their own eyes. Something else would have to be tried, some different approach that might succeed where the dancing cure had failed. But what that approach might be, no one could say with any certainty. The plague had defeated their first strategy, and it showed no signs of yielding to their second thoughts. The summer sun continued to beat down upon the stages, upon the dancers, upon the crowds that now watched with more fear than fascination. The river ill flowed past the city, as it always had, indifferent to the suffering along its banks. And somewhere in the chambers where decisions were made, the leaders of Strasbourg began to consider possibilities that had previously seemed unthinkable. If medicine had failed, and music had failed, perhaps only the divine could provide the remedy that the city so desperately needed. The conversation turned toward saints and shrines, toward pilgrimages and prayers, toward the last resort of those who had exhausted every earthly option. The affliction reached its terrible crescendo in the weeks that followed, swelling beyond anything the people of Strasbourg had imagined possible. What had begun with a single woman dancing in a narrow street had become a tide of writhing bodies that seemed to threaten the very foundations of the city. The count of dancers climbed past 100, then 200, then continued upward toward a number that chroniclers of the era would record with a mixture of precision and disbelief. By the peak of the outbreak, approximately 400 souls had been seized by the compulsion, their bodies moving without rest through the sweltering days and the humid nights of that endless summer. 400 people dancing. The figure staggers the imagination even now, centuries removed from the event. Picture them scattered across the public spaces of the city, clustered on the stages that had been built to contain them, spilling into streets and squares where no platforms existed. Picture them moving in their individual rhythms, some slow and shuffling, others wild and frantic. All of them trapped in a performance they had never auditioned for and could not escape. The sound of their collective movement filled the air, a constant percussion of feet against stone and wood that became the heartbeat of a city gone mad. The eyewitness accounts that survive from this period paint scenes of almost unbearable intensity. Observers describe dancers whose feet had been reduced to bloody ruins, the skin worn away entirely, the flesh beneath exposed to the filthy ground. These sufferers left trails of red wherever they moved, their steps marked by the evidence of their destruction. Yet they did not stop, could not stop, their bodies continuing to respond to that invisible command, even as the physical cost mounted beyond all reason. Some of the afflicted foamed at the mouth, a white froth gathering at the corners of their lips and spilling down their chins. This symptom terrified those who witnessed it, for it suggested a kind of possession or madness that went beyond mere physical compulsion. The dancers who displayed this sign seemed to have departed from their humanity entirely, their eyes rolling back, their faces contorted into expressions that bore no resemblance to anything observers had seen before. They had become something other than themselves, vessels for a force that no one could name or understand. The cries of the dancers formed a chorus of suffering that echoed through the streets at all hours. They called out for water, for rest, for someone to help them. They screamed the names of family members, of saints, of God himself. They begged for mercy in voices that grew hoarse and then silent, their throats too raw to produce sound, even as their mouths continued to move. And through it all, their bodies kept dancing, indifferent to the pleas that issued from their lips. Deaths occurred with increasing frequency as the outbreak reached its peak. The exact number would never be determined with certainty, for record-keeping in that era was imperfect, and the chaos of the crisis made accurate counting impossible. But chronicles speak of bodies being carried away from the stages and the streets, of hasty burials conducted without proper ceremony, of families left to mourn loved ones who had danced themselves into eternity. Some estimates suggest that dozens perished, their hearts or their minds simply giving out under the strain of unceasing movement. The physicians who had recommended the dancing cure watched their patients die and found themselves without explanations or alternatives. They had applied their learning to the problem and had been proven catastrophically wrong. The humoral theory that had guided their intervention lay in ruins, its predictions contradicted by the mounting evidence of failure. Some of these learned men withdrew from public view entirely, unable to face the consequences of their advice. Others stubbornly maintained that the treatment would have worked if only it had been applied correctly, if only the patients had been stronger, if only some unknowable factor had been different. Stages that had been constructed with such purpose now resembled nothing so much as scaffolds for a mass execution. The wooden platforms were slick with blood and other fluids, their surfaces worn into grooves by the endless passage of dancing feet. The shelters that had been erected to provide shade had been knocked askew or trampled entirely. The barrels that had held water and wine stood empty, and no one came to refill them. The infrastructure of care had collapsed under the weight of the catastrophe it had been meant to address. Among the dancers, a terrible solidarity had emerged. They moved together without coordination, each following their own compulsion, yet somehow forming a collective. Veterans of the affliction, those who had been dancing for weeks, occupied spaces near those who had only recently been seized. They could not help one another, could not offer comfort or relief, but their shared suffering created a bond that transcended the isolation of their individual torments. They were a community of the damned, united by a fate none of them had chosen. The families who maintained their vigils near the stages experienced their own form of torment. They watched husbands and wives, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters move through the motions of the dance, growing weaker with each passing hour. They tried to provide what assistance they could, holding cups of water to parched lips, wiping sweat from fevered brows, speaking words of encouragement that the dancers may or may not have heard. No, they could not stop the dancing, could not release their loved ones from the grip of whatever force had seized them. Children who lost parents to the plague-faced futures of uncertainty and hardship. The social structures of the era provided little support for orphans, and those without extended family to take them in might find themselves begging in the streets or bound out as servants to whoever would have them. Parents who lost children experienced the grief compounded by the strangeness of the circumstances. To lose a child to fever or accident was tragedy enough, but to lose one to an inexplicable compulsion to dance was something for which no framework of understanding existed. The city itself seemed to sicken along with its inhabitants. Normal commerce ground nearly to a halt as the crisis consumed all attention and resources. Shops closed because their owners were dancing or because their customers had fled. Markets stood empty because the merchants feared to display their goods in proximity to the afflicted. The guilds that governed economic life found their authority meaningless in the face of a catastrophe that respected no boundaries of trade or profession. The sound of the musicians, who still played on some of the stages, had taken on a mournful quality. The drummers beat their instruments with less enthusiasm than before, their rhythms slowing as the futility of their task became apparent. The pipers played melodies that seemed more like dirges than dance tunes. Even these hired performers, who had no personal stake in the outcome, could not maintain their professional detachment in the face of so much suffering. Religious processions wound through the streets, faithful carrying crosses and icons, chanting prayers for deliverance. These displays of piety drew crowds of their own. Citizens who had not been afflicted sought reassurance in the rituals of their faith. Smell of incense mingled with the stench of unwashed bodies and spilled blood. The sound of hymns competed with the cries of the dancers and the music of the hired bands. Sacred and profane, order and chaos existed side by side in a city that had lost its bearings entirely. The authorities who governed Strasbourg found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. They had tried to manage the crisis through rational intervention and had failed spectacularly. They had tried to contain the affliction and had watched it spread. They had consulted physicians and followed their advice, only to see the death toll climb. Now they faced a situation that seemed beyond the capacity of human wisdom to address, a problem that mocked their pretensions to control and competence. Some members of the council advocated for more extreme measures. Perhaps the dancers should be forcibly restrained, tied down until the compulsion passed. Perhaps they should be isolated outside the city walls, removed from contact with the healthy population. Perhaps they should be treated as criminals or madmen, locked away in cells where they could dance themselves to death without disturbing the peace of their neighbors. These proposals reflected the desperation of men who had run out of better ideas. Others counseled patience and prayer, arguing that the outbreak must eventually burn itself out. No fever lasted forever. No possession was permanent. The dancers would either recover or die, and in either case, the crisis would eventually end. The role of the authorities was to maintain order, to prevent panic, to ensure that the fabric of society survived until the storm had passed. This passive approach satisfied no one, but it had the virtue of requiring no further action that might make things worse. The common people of Strasbourg, those who had not been afflicted, lived in a state of constant anxiety. They went about their daily tasks with one eye always watching for signs of the compulsion in themselves or their neighbors. A twitch of the foot, a sudden urge to move, could send waves of terror through anyone who experienced them. The boundary between the healthy and the sick had proven terrifyingly permeable, and no one could say with confidence that they would not be the next to cross it. Superstitions flourished in this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. People carried amulets and charms, wore special colors, avoided particular streets or buildings. They blamed the crisis on Jews, on witches, on foreigners, on anyone who seemed different or vulnerable. Accusations flew, and in some cases violence followed, as the community sought scapegoats for a disaster that defied explanation. The social bonds that normally held people together frayed under the strain, replaced by suspicion and recrimination. And through it all, the dancers continued to dance. They moved on the stages and in the streets, in the squares and along the riverbanks. They danced in the morning light and in the darkness of midnight. They danced through rain showers that briefly cooled their fevered skin and through the return of the punishing sun. They danced until their bodies could dance no more, and then some of them fell and did not rise, while others somehow found the strength to continue. The peak of the outbreak represented a kind of collective nightmare from which the city could not awaken. The normal categories of experience had been suspended, replaced by a reality that seemed to belong to fever dreams or tales of the damned. 400 people dancing, bleeding, crying out, dying, while the rest of the population watched in helpless horror. This was not how the world was supposed to work, not how human bodies were supposed to behave. Something fundamental had broken, and no one knew how to fix it. The summer of 1518 had already been marked by hardship before the dancing began. Famine and disease had weakened the population, had strained the resources of charity and governance. Now, this inexplicable plague had been added to the burden, a final weight that seemed designed to crush whatever hope remained. The people of Strasbourg had endured much, but they had never endured anything like this. They looked to their leaders for guidance and found only confusion. They looked to their physicians for cures and found only failure. They looked to their priests for explanation and found only mystery. The only certainty was that the dancing continued, relentless and incomprehensible, a phenomenon that would be remembered and debated for centuries to come. The stages groaned under the weight of their occupants. The music played on, though with diminishing conviction. And the city waited, suspended between hope and despair, for some sign that the nightmare might finally be approaching its end. The turning point came not through any sudden revelation, but through the slow accumulation of failure. The authorities of Strasbourg, having watched their carefully planned intervention produce nothing but increased suffering and death, finally acknowledged what had become obvious to everyone else. The dancing cure had not worked. The music and the stages and the higher performers had accomplished nothing except to provide a more organized setting for the catastrophe. Something entirely different would have to be attempted, and the only realm that had not yet been fully explored was the realm of the sacred. The decision to abandon the secular approach and turn to religious intervention represented a significant shift in how the crisis was understood. The physicians had treated the dancing as a medical condition, an imbalance of humors that could be corrected through physical means. The council had treated it as a civic problem, a disruption to be managed through organization and resources. Now, both groups stepped aside, acknowledging that the affliction lay beyond their competence. The priests and the church would take the lead, applying remedies that belonged to a different order of reality entirely. The name that emerged most prominently in these discussions was that of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose cult had spread throughout the German lands and beyond. This saint held a particular significance for those suffering from conditions that caused involuntary movement. In the folklore of the region, Saint Vitus was believed to have power over what people called the dancing curse, an affliction that could seize the body and force it to move against the will of its owner. To invoke his name was to appeal to the one figure in the celestial hierarchy who might understand and remedy such suffering. The connection between Saint Vitus and uncontrollable dancing had deep roots in medieval belief. According to legend, the young Vitus had been martyred during the persecutions of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, suffering terrible torments before achieving the crown of sainthood. Among the miracles attributed to him after death was the power to cure those afflicted with convulsive disorders, conditions that caused the body to shake and jerk beyond the control of the sufferer. Over time, this association had expanded to include any form of involuntary movement, including the strange compulsion to dance that periodically swept through communities in the medieval world. The shrine of Saint Vitus that the authorities of Strasbourg turned to was located in the Vosges Mountains, a range of forested peaks that rose to the west of the city. This holy site had drawn pilgrims for generations, people seeking cures for ailments that ordinary medicine could not address. The journey to the shrine was arduous, requiring travel through rugged terrain, but the reputation of the place for miraculous healings made the effort worthwhile for those who had exhausted all other options. Now, the dancers of Strasbourg would make this journey, carried, if necessary, to seek the intercession of the saint who held power over their affliction. The logistics of transporting hundreds of dancing people through mountainous countryside presented enormous challenges. Many of the afflicted could barely walk in a straight line, let alone navigate forest paths and rocky slopes. Their bodies continued to move in their compulsive patterns, even as they were guided or carried toward the shrine. Some had to be restrained to prevent them from dancing off cliffs or into rivers. Others were loaded onto carts, their limbs still twitching and jerking as the vehicles bumped along the primitive roads. The procession that made its way toward the Vosges must have presented an extraordinary spectacle to anyone who witnessed it. Imagine a column of suffering humanity stretching along the mountain paths, some walking with the support of family members, others carried on litters or in the arms of strong men hired for the purpose. The sound of their involuntary movements mixed with prayers and hymns sung by the priests who accompanied them. The smell of unwashed bodies and festering wounds filled the forest air. This was a pilgrimage unlike any other, a journey of the desperate toward a hope they could barely articulate. The priests who led this expedition carried with them the full apparatus of religious power. The crucifixes and icons of Saint Vitus were held aloft at the front of the column. Holy water was sprinkled on the afflicted at regular intervals. Prayers were recited continuously, a wall of sacred words meant to protect the travelers from whatever demonic forces might be responsible for their suffering. The journey itself was conceived as a form of penance and purification, a physical ordeal that might help to expiate whatever sins had brought this punishment upon the community. Upon reaching the shrine, the dancers were brought into the presence of the holy relics associated with Saint Vitus. These sacred objects, believed to retain something of the saint's spiritual power, were touched to the bodies of the afflicted in ceremonies conducted by the priests. The dancers were made to kneel, insofar as their condition allowed, before altars decorated with images of the martyr. They were given blessed bread and wine, were anointed with holy oil, were wrapped in cloths that had touched the relics. Every resource of medieval piety was deployed in the effort to break the curse that held them. Special masses were celebrated for the intention of the dancers, the ancient words of the liturgy rising toward heaven in supplication. The priests called upon Saint Vitus by name, recounting his martyrdom and his miracles, reminding him of his special relationship with those who suffered from dancing afflictions. They begged for his intercession with God, for his prayers on behalf of these tormented souls. The atmosphere in the shrine was thick with incense and expectation. It gathered faithful straining for any sign that their appeals were being heard. Blessed amulets were distributed to the dancers. Small objects inscribed with prayers or containing fragments of material associated with the saint. These talismans were meant to be worn close to the body, providing ongoing protection against the forces that had caused the affliction. The dancers clutched these objects with whatever grip their trembling hands could manage, their fingers closing around the promise of divine assistance. Even those too exhausted to speak could hold an amulet, could feel its weight against their skin, could draw whatever comfort it might provide. The families who had accompanied their afflicted loved ones to the shrine added their own prayers to those of the priests. Wives knelt beside dancing husbands, mothers beside dancing children, their voices joining the chorus of supplication. They made vows and promises, pledging pilgrimages and donations if only their family members might be restored to health. They wept and pleaded with a saint they could not see, trusting that somehow their words would reach him and move him to compassion. The days spent at the shrine took on a rhythm of their own, structured around the religious services that punctuated the hours. Morning masses gave way to afternoon prayers, which gave way to evening vigils. The dancers were brought repeatedly into the presence of the relics, the ceremonies repeated in the hope that persistence might succeed where single efforts had failed. The priests showed no signs of discouragement, maintaining their faith that divine intervention would come in its own time, in its own way. And gradually, imperceptibly at first, something began to change. The movements of some dancers grew less frantic, their bodies responding to a slackening of the compulsion that had driven them. A woman who had danced for weeks found herself able to stand still for minutes at a time, then for longer periods. A man whose legs had carried him through countless involuntary steps discovered that he could control them again, could choose to walk or to rest. The curse was lifting, slowly and unevenly, but lifting nonetheless. The news of these improvements spread quickly through the community gathered at the shrine. Each recovery was celebrated as a miracle, a direct intervention by Saint Vitus in response to the prayers that had been offered. The priests pointed to these healings as proof of the saint's power and the efficacy of the religious approach. Those who had doubted, who had wondered whether the journey to the mountains was merely another futile gesture, found their skepticism dissolving in the face of evidence they could see with their own eyes. Not everyone recovered at the shrine. Some dancers remained in the grip of their affliction, despite all the prayers and ceremonies and blessed objects. These stubborn cases were attributed to various causes. Perhaps insufficient faith on the part of the sufferer, perhaps sins too grave to be easily forgiven, perhaps simply the mysterious workings of divine will that mortals could not expect to understand. The priests assured the families of these continuing victims that they should not lose hope, that healing might still come in God's own time. The return journey to Strasbourg was markedly different from the outward procession. Many who had been carried to the shrine now walked on their own feet, their bodies finally under their own control. They moved slowly, weakened by their ordeal, but they moved by choice rather than compulsion. The prayers that accompanied them now included expressions of thanksgiving alongside continued petitions for those still afflicted. The atmosphere had shifted from desperation to cautious hope. Back in the city, those who had remained behind received the returning pilgrims with a mixture of joy and apprehension. Joy for those who had been healed, whose dancing had finally stopped. Lives might now return to something resembling normal. Apprehension because the plague had not been entirely defeated, because some dancers still moved through the streets, because no one could say with certainty that the crisis was truly over. The shadow of the affliction still hung over Strasbourg, even as the worst seemed to have passed. The shrine of Saint Vitus received credit for turning the tide of the outbreak. The authorities who had ordered the pilgrimage congratulated themselves on finally finding an approach that worked, even if it had taken them far too long to abandon the failed medical interventions. The priests who had led the religious ceremonies saw their status enhanced, their expertise in spiritual matters validated by the results they had achieved. The cult of Saint Vitus gained new devotees among those who had witnessed or experienced his healing power. The dancers who recovered faced the long process of rebuilding their lives and their bodies. Weeks of continuous movement had left them physically devastated, their muscles wasted, their feet damaged, their constitutions weakened. Many would never fully regain the strength and health they had possessed before the affliction seized them. They bore the marks of their ordeal in their flesh and in their memories, permanent reminders of those terrible days when their bodies had betrayed them so completely. The shrine in the Vosges Mountains would continue to draw pilgrims for generations to come, its reputation enhanced by the events of 1518. People suffering from convulsive disorders, from tremors and twitches and involuntary movements of all kinds, would make the journey to seek the intercession of Saint Vitus. Some would find relief, others would not, but all would participate in a tradition of faith and healing that stretched back centuries and would continue for centuries more. For the people of Strasbourg, the pilgrimage to the shrine marked the beginning of the end of their nightmare. The dancing plague that had terrorized their city for weeks was finally subsiding, its grip loosening on one victim after another. The stages that had been built in the public squares stood empty now, their purpose fulfilled, their blood-stained surfaces a testament to the suffering that had unfolded upon them. The musicians who had played without ceasing finally fell silent, their instruments put away, their strange employment concluded. The city began the slow process of returning to normal, though normal would never mean quite the same thing again. Something had happened in the summer of 1518 that defied easy explanation, that challenged the boundaries of what people believed possible. The memory of the dancing plague would linger in Strasbourg for generations, passed down through families who had witnessed it or lost members to it, to become part of the city's identity, a strange and terrible chapter in its long history, never to be forgotten and never to be fully understood. September arrived in Strasbourg like a benediction, bringing with it the first hints of cooler air and the gradual loosening of the terrible grip that had held the city for so many weeks. The dancing plague that had seemed unstoppable was finally, unmistakably fading. Each day brought news of another recovery, another dancer who had regained control of their body, another family reunited with a member they had feared lost forever. The nightmare was not ending all at once, but it was ending, and that was enough to kindle hope in hearts that had nearly forgotten what hope felt like. The dancers who recovered did so at different rates and in different ways. Some experienced a sudden cessation, their bodies simply stopping as if a switch had been thrown. One moment they were dancing, the next they were standing still, blinking in confusion at the world around them. Others underwent a more gradual transition, their movements slowing over hours or days, the compulsion weakening by degrees until it finally released them entirely. A few seemed to hover at the threshold for extended periods, dancing for a time, then resting, then dancing again, before finally achieving permanent freedom. The physical condition of the survivors varied enormously depending on how long they had been afflicted and how violently they had danced. Those who had been seized early in the outbreak and had danced for the full duration bore the heaviest burdens. Their bodies had been pushed far beyond normal limits, their muscles depleted, their hearts strained, their feet damaged in ways that might never fully heal. Some would walk with limps for the rest of their lives. Others would never walk at all, their legs too weakened to support their weight. The psychological wounds proved equally varied and in some ways more difficult to assess. The dancers had experienced something that no framework of understanding could adequately contain. They had watched their own bodies move against their will, had felt themselves trapped inside flesh that no longer obeyed their commands. This violation of the most basic assumptions about selfhood and autonomy left marks that did not show on the surface but ran deep nonetheless. Many survivors spoke of nightmares, of sudden fears, of a persistent anxiety that the compulsion might return at any moment. The families who had kept vigil through the crisis now faced the challenge of caring for members who had been fundamentally changed by their ordeal. Wives nursed husbands back to health, spooning broth into mouths too weak to chew solid food. Parents carried children who could not yet walk on their own, their young bodies depleted by exertions no child should ever have to endure. The work of recovery would take months, and for some, it would never be complete. The dancing plague had taken its toll, not just on individuals, but on entire households. The city itself bore scars that would take time to fade. The wooden stages that had been constructed in the public squares were dismantled, their blood-stained planks carted away and burned. The streets where dancers had worn grooves into the cobblestones were repaired and cleaned. The shelters and barrels and other infrastructure of the failed intervention were removed, since by erasing the physical evidence, the community could somehow erase the memory of what had happened. But memories proved more stubborn than wooden platforms. The economic damage caused by the outbreak would take years to fully repair. Businesses had closed, trades had been disrupted, the normal flow of commerce had been interrupted for weeks. Some merchants had fled the city entirely during the height of the crisis, taking their goods and their capital to places where the dancing plague had not reached. Others had stayed, but lost customers who feared to venture into streets where afflicted people might be encountered. The guilds that governed economic life worked to restore order, but the task was complicated by the losses the plague had inflicted. Among the deaths attributed to the dancing plague, some families struggled to obtain proper burials for their loved ones. The circumstances of these deaths were so unusual that questions arose about whether the deceased should be buried in consecrated ground. Had they died in a state of grace, or had the dancing represented some form of sin or possession that tainted their souls? The priests who had to make these determinations generally erred on the side of mercy, allowing the victims to be laid to rest alongside other Christians. But the debates themselves added another layer of pain to already grieving families. The physicians who had advised the failed dancing cure found themselves in awkward positions as the crisis subsided. Their recommendations had been followed, and the results had been disastrous. Some attempted to defend their actions, arguing that the intervention would have worked if external circumstances had been different. Others quietly withdrew from public practice, their reputations damaged beyond easy repair. The relationship between the medical profession and the civic authorities had been strained by the experience, and it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been lost. The chroniclers of the era began their work of recording what had happened, knowing that they were documenting something extraordinary. These writers, some of them physicians themselves, some of them civic officials, some of them simply educated observers, understood that the events of 1518 deserved to be preserved for posterity. The interviewed survivors gathered testimony from witnesses, compiled statistics as best they could, given the chaotic circumstances. Their accounts would become the primary sources through which later generations would learn of the dancing plague. One of the most detailed records came from a physician named Paracelsus, who would later become famous for his contributions to medical theory. Though he did not witness the outbreak firsthand, he gathered information about it and included observations in his writings. Paracelsus rejected the humoral explanations that had guided the failed intervention, proposing instead that the dancing represented a form of disease that affected the imagination rather than the body. This psychological interpretation was ahead of his time and would not gain widespread acceptance for centuries. The civic records of Strasbourg also preserved information about the outbreak. documenting the decisions made by the council, the expenses incurred for stages and musicians and pilgrimages, the names of some of those who had been afflicted. These dry administrative documents lacked the drama of narrative accounts, but provided valuable details that helped later researchers understand the scope and duration of the crisis. The bureaucratic impulse to record and quantify had created a paper trail that would survive the centuries. Religious writers interpreted the events through the lens of their faith, seeing in the dancing plague evidence of divine judgment or demonic attack. Some argued that the affliction had been sent as punishment for the sins of the community, a warning that repentance was urgently needed. Others focused on the apparent success of the pilgrimage to Saint Vitus, seeing in this outcome proof of the saint's power and the efficacy of religious remedies. These theological interpretations shaped how the outbreak was remembered and discussed in the years immediately following. The survivors themselves rarely left written records of their experiences, for most of them belonged to social classes that did not produce literature. Their stories were preserved, if at all, through oral tradition, passed down through families and communities in forms that inevitably changed with each retelling. What they actually felt during their weeks of compulsive dancing, what thoughts passed through their minds as their bodies moved without their consent, remained largely unrecorded. The inner experience of the affliction died with those who had lived through it. As autumn deepened and the last traces of the outbreak faded, Strasbourg began to look forward rather than backward. The harvest season brought its own concerns, the need to gather whatever crops the difficult year had produced and store them against the coming winter. The rhythms of ordinary life reasserted themselves, the daily rounds of work and worship and rest that had been so dramatically interrupted. People who had spent weeks watching dancers or caring for afflicted family members returned to the routines that defined their existence. Yet the memory of the dancing plague could not be entirely suppressed. It surfaced in conversations, in prayers, in the nightmares of those who had witnessed it. Parents told children about the terrible summer when hundreds of people had danced themselves to exhaustion and death. Preachers referenced the outbreak in sermons about sin and punishment. The experience had left a mark on the collective consciousness of the community that would not fade for generations. The shrine of Saint Vitus in the Vosges Mountains saw increased traffic in the years following the outbreak. Word had spread of the healings that had occurred there, and people suffering from convulsive disorders came from throughout the region seeking similar relief. The cult of the saint, already well established, grew stronger as a result of the events in Strasbourg. Votive offerings accumulated at the shrine, tokens of gratitude from those who believed themselves cured through the saint's intercession. For the city council and the physicians who had managed the crisis so poorly, the aftermath brought uncomfortable questions that had no good answers. Why had they persisted with the dancing cure, even as evidence mounted that it was not working? Why had they not turned to religious remedies sooner? Why had so many people died before the authorities changed course? These questions were asked quietly at first, then more openly as the immediate danger receded and people had time to reflect on what had happened. The dancing plague of 1518 would eventually take its place in the historical record as one of the strangest episodes of mass affliction ever documented. Scholars in later centuries would puzzle over it, proposing various explanations and debating their merits. The event would be cited in studies of mass hysteria, of medieval medicine, of the social conditions that could produce such extraordinary phenomena. It would become a case study, a cautionary tale, a mystery that resisted final resolution. But for those who lived through it, the dancing plague was not a case study or a historical curiosity. It was a lived experience of terror and suffering, of watching loved ones dance until they collapsed, of feeling one's own body move against one's will. The survivors carried this experience with them for the rest of their lives, a burden that could be shared but never fully explained. They had seen something that should not have been possible, and that seeing had changed them in ways they could not always articulate. The city of Strasbourg would face many challenges in the years and decades ahead. Religious conflicts would divide the community as the Reformation spread through the German lands. Economic pressures would strain the social fabric. Wars and plagues of more conventional sorts would take their toll. But none of these subsequent crises would quite match the strangeness of what had happened in the summer of 1518. The dancing plague occupied a unique place in the city's history. A chapter unlike any other, a reminder that the world could produce phenomena that defied all understanding. As the year drew toward its close and winter settled over the region, the people of Strasbourg gave thanks for their deliverance. They had survived something unprecedented, something that had tested every resource of medicine and governance and faith. They had lost neighbors and family members, had watched their city descend into chaos, had seen the boundaries of the possible stretched beyond recognition, and they had emerged on the other side, scarred but alive, ready to face whatever the future might bring. The dancing had stopped, and for now, that was enough. Centuries after the dancers of Strasbourg finally came to rest, scholars and scientists began to search for explanations that might satisfy the modern mind. The religious interpretations that had made sense to medieval observers no longer carried the same weight in an age of reason and empirical investigation. If demons and curses and saintly interventions were to be set aside, then some natural cause must be found for the extraordinary events of 1518. The search for such a cause led researchers down many paths, but one theory emerged that seemed to offer at least a partial answer to the mystery. The theory centered on a humble grain that formed the foundation of the medieval diet. Rye bread was the staple food of the common people throughout the German lands and beyond, the daily sustenance that kept bodies alive through seasons of plenty and seasons of want. The poor especially depended on rye, for wheat was expensive and beyond their means. They ate rye bread at every meal, year after year, generation after generation. And sometimes, under certain conditions, that rye carried within it the seeds of madness. The culprit was a fungus known to modern science as Claviceps purpurea, though medieval farmers knew it only as a strange growth that sometimes appeared on their grain. This organism infected rye plants during wet growing seasons, replacing the healthy kernels with dark, elongated structures called ergots. These ergots resembled the original grain closely enough that they could easily pass unnoticed during harvest and milling. They would be ground into flour along with the healthy rye, baked into bread, and consumed by people who had no idea they were ingesting something profoundly dangerous. The chemicals contained within ergot belonged to a family of compounds that would later be recognized as having powerful effects on the human nervous system. These substances, called ergot alkaloids, can cause a range of symptoms when consumed in sufficient quantities. Some of these symptoms are physical, including constriction of blood vessels that can lead to gangrene in the extremities. Others are neurological, including convulsions, spasms, and involuntary movements that the sufferer cannot control. Still others affect the mind itself, producing hallucinations, delusions, and states of altered consciousness. The history of ergot poisoning in medieval Europe is long and terrible. Epidemics of what was then called St. Anthony's fire swept through communities at irregular intervals, leaving behind trails of suffering and death. Victims experienced burning sensations in their limbs as blood flow was restricted by the constricting action of the alkaloids. Fingers and toes blackened and fell off. Entire limbs sometimes had to be amputated to prevent the spread of gangrene. The fortunate died quickly, while the less fortunate lingered in agony for weeks or months. The convulsive form of ergotism produced different symptoms, but was no less devastating. Sufferers experienced violent muscle contractions that twisted their bodies into contorted postures. They writhed and jerked, their limbs moving in patterns they could not control. They reported visions and sensations that bore no relationship to external reality, or minds invaded by the chemicals coursing through their systems. These symptoms could persist for days or weeks, depending on how much contaminated grain the victim had consumed. When researchers in later centuries looked back at the dancing plague of 1518, they saw in these symptoms a possible explanation for what had happened. The involuntary movements, the apparent inability of the dancers to stop. The way the affliction seemed to spread through certain segments of the population while sparing others. All of these features could potentially be explained by ergot poisoning. Perhaps the dancers had not been victims of demonic possession or divine punishment, but simply of contaminated food. The theory gained support from the environmental conditions that prevailed in the years leading up to the outbreak. The region around Strasbourg had experienced a series of wet growing seasons, precisely the conditions that favored the growth of ergot fungus on rye plants. The harvests had been poor, which meant that farmers might have been less selective about the grain they kept, more willing to overlook the dark kernels mixed in with the healthy ones. The poor, who depended most heavily on rye bread, and who formed the majority of the dancing plague victims, would have been most exposed to any contamination. The timing of the outbreak also seemed consistent with the ergot theory. The dancing began in July, during the summer months when bread baked from the previous autumn's harvest would still be in circulation. If that harvest had been contaminated, the effects might not become apparent until months later, when enough of the toxic grain had been consumed to produce symptoms. The slow accumulation of ergot alkaloids in the bodies of the victims could explain why the outbreak built gradually, rather than appearing all at once. Proponents of the ergot theory pointed to other historical episodes that seemed to follow similar patterns. Outbreaks of convulsive illness had occurred throughout medieval Europe, often in regions where rye was the dominant grain and often following wet growing seasons. The Salem witch trials of 1692 have been attributed by some researchers to ergot poisoning. The strange behaviors of the accused witches potentially explained by neurological effects of contaminated grain. A pattern seemed to emerge, linking ergot to episodes of mass affliction across centuries and continents. Yet the theory, compelling as it appeared, could not fully account for all the features of the dancing plague. Critics pointed out significant problems that the ergot explanation left unresolved. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, while they included involuntary movements, did not typically manifest as coordinated dancing. Convulsions and spasms were random, chaotic, carrying little resemblance to the rhythmic movements that witnesses described seeing in Strasbourg. The dancers did not simply twitch and jerk, but performed recognizable dance steps, their bodies moving in ways that suggested purpose rather than mere neurological malfunction. The social pattern of the outbreak also posed difficulties for the ergot theory. If contaminated bread was the cause, then why did the affliction spread the way it did, apparently passing from person to person rather than appearing simultaneously in everyone who had eaten the same food? The dancing plague seemed to have a contagious quality, with new cases appearing after exposure to existing cases, a pattern more consistent with psychological than with toxicological causes. Konica poisoning did not spread from person to person through contact or observation. The geographic concentration of the outbreak raised additional questions. Strasbourg was not the only city in the region where people ate rye bread. Yet, the dancing plague did not spread to neighboring communities in the way that a foodborne illness might be expected to spread. The affliction remained largely confined to a single location, affecting that location intensely while leaving surrounding areas untouched. This pattern suggested something specific to Strasbourg rather than something in the regional food supply. The response of the dancers to different interventions also complicated the ergot explanation. If the affliction was purely chemical in origin, then why did it seem to subside after the pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus? Ergot alkaloids do not respond to prayer or holy relics. They metabolize out of the body at their own pace, regardless of what religious ceremonies the sufferer might participate in. The apparent effectiveness of the religious intervention suggested that psychological factors played a role in both the onset and the resolution of the crisis. Some researchers attempted to reconcile these difficulties by proposing that ergot poisoning might have been one factor among several. Perhaps the alkaloids created a state of neurological vulnerability that made certain individuals susceptible to a form of mass suggestion. The contaminated grain could have laid the groundwork, weakening the normal boundaries between individual will and external influence, while social and psychological factors determined how that vulnerability manifested. This hybrid theory had the advantage of incorporating multiple causes, but the disadvantage of being difficult to test or verify. The debate over the ergot theory continues among scholars who studied the dancing plague. Some maintain that the evidence strongly supports a toxicological explanation, pointing to the environmental conditions, the demographic pattern of victims, and the similarity to other historical episodes of mass convulsive illness. Others argue that the distinctive features of the Strasbourg outbreak, particularly the dance-like quality of the movements and the apparent contagion, cannot be adequately explained by ergot alone. The truth may lie somewhere between these positions, in a complex interaction of factors that defies simple categorization. What the ergot theory does accomplish, regardless of its ultimate validity, is to remind us that the people of 1518 lived in a world of material vulnerabilities that we can scarcely imagine today. Their food supply was uncertain and often dangerous. They ate whatever they could get without the quality controls and safety regulations that modern consumers take for granted. They had no way of knowing whether the bread they consumed might be slowly poisoning them. No tests they could perform, no labels they could read. They were at the mercy of forces beyond their perception or control. The fungus that infected their grain had been doing so for thousands of years, since humans first began cultivating rye in the ancient world. It would continue to do so for centuries after the dancing plague, causing sporadic outbreaks of illness wherever conditions favored its growth. Only in modern times, with the development of agricultural science and food safety standards, would the threat of ergot poisoning be largely eliminated from developed societies. The people of Strasbourg lived at the mercy of this invisible enemy, as their ancestors had, and as their descendants would for generations to come. Whether or not ergot was the primary cause of the dancing plague, it remains part of the larger context in which the outbreak occurred. The people who danced through the streets of Strasbourg were people whose bodies had been stressed by years of poor nutrition, whose immune systems had been weakened by repeated exposure to disease, whose minds had been shaped by beliefs and fears that made them vulnerable to certain kinds of suggestion. The ergot fungus, if it was present, would have been only one element in a complex matrix of factors that combined to produce an unprecedented crisis. The search for explanations continues because the dancing plague resists easy answers. Each theory proposed illuminates certain aspects of the phenomenon while leaving others in shadow. The ergot theory explains the involuntary movements, but not the dance-like quality. It explains the concentration among the poor, but not the apparent contagion. It explains the timing, but not the geographic limitation. It's like all attempts to understand this strange episode, it offers partial illumination rather than complete clarity. Perhaps that is the most honest conclusion that can be drawn about the role of ergot in the dancing plague. It may have been a contributing factor, one piece of a puzzle that involves many pieces. It may have created conditions of vulnerability that other factors then exploited, or it may have been entirely absent, a red herring that distracts from the true causes of the outbreak. The evidence is too fragmentary and too distant to support confident conclusions. What we can say is that the people of Strasbourg lived in a world where such poisoning was possible, where the bread that sustained life could also carry the seeds of madness, and where the boundary between nourishment and toxin was never entirely clear. If the ergot theory offers a chemical explanation for the dancing plague, another line of inquiry seeks the answer not in the body, but in the mind. This approach developed over centuries of observation and refined by modern psychology, proposes that the outbreak in Strasbourg was fundamentally a psychological phenomenon, a case of what contemporary researchers call mass psychogenic illness. According to this theory, the dancers were not poisoned by contaminated grain, but seized by a form of collective hysteria, spread through the population like a contagion of the spirit. The concept of mass psychogenic illness rests on a recognition that the human mind possesses extraordinary power over the human body. Under certain conditions, psychological states can produce physical symptoms that are entirely real, entirely debilitating, and entirely beyond the conscious control of the sufferer. A person who believes strongly enough that they are ill may actually become ill, their body manifesting symptoms that have no organic cause. A person who witnesses others experiencing certain symptoms may find those same symptoms appearing in their own body, even without any physical contact or shared exposure to toxins. The conditions that prevailed in Strasbourg in 1518 were precisely the conditions that modern researchers have identified as conducive to outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness. The population had been subjected to years of cumulative stress, the grinding pressure of repeated famines, recurrent epidemics, economic hardship, and social instability. These stresses had depleted not only physical resources, but psychological ones as well. The people were exhausted in body and spirit, their resilience worn thin, their capacity to cope with additional challenges severely diminished. Belief systems also played a crucial role in creating vulnerability to this kind of outbreak. The people of Strasbourg inhabited a world saturated with supernatural beliefs, a world where divine punishment and demonic possession were accepted as real possibilities. They knew that God might send afflictions upon sinful communities, that the devil might seize control of human bodies, that saints could intervene to cure or to curse. These beliefs provided a framework within which unusual experiences could be interpreted, and that framework could shape how those experiences manifested and spread. The specific belief in a dancing curse was well established in the region long before Frau Troffea took her first involuntary steps. People knew that such afflictions existed, knew that they could seize individuals without warning, knew that they were associated with the power of Saint Vitus. This cultural knowledge meant that when strange symptoms appeared, there was a ready-made category into which they could be placed. The dancing plague was not an entirely novel phenomenon, but an instance of something that the community already believed possible. When Frau Troffea began to dance, her behavior was interpreted through this lens of existing belief. She was not simply a woman having a strange episode, but a victim of a known affliction, a curse that could potentially spread to others. This interpretation shaped how observers responded to her, how they talked about what they were seeing, how they communicated the news to others. The language they used and the fears they expressed created an atmosphere in which similar symptoms became more likely to appear in others. The mechanism by which such symptoms spread remains imperfectly understood, but researchers have proposed several possibilities. One involves a process of unconscious imitation, in which observing someone else's symptoms triggers similar symptoms in the observer without any conscious decision to mimic what has been seen. The mirror neurons that allow humans to learn through observation may play a role, causing the body to rehearse internally what the eyes perceive externally. Under conditions of high stress and strong belief, this internal rehearsal may cross the threshold into actual physical manifestation. Another mechanism involves the power of expectation and fear. A person who believes that they might be seized by an affliction may become hypervigilant, monitoring their own body for any sign of the dreaded symptoms. This intense self-scrutiny can amplify normal bodily sensations, interpreting ordinary twitches or urges to move as the beginning of something more sinister. The anxiety produced by this monitoring can itself produce physical symptoms, which are then interpreted as confirmation that the feared affliction has arrived. A self-fulfilling prophecy unfolds, with belief creating the very reality that was feared. Social dynamics also contribute to the spread of mass psychogenic illness. Humans are profoundly social creatures, shaped by the groups to which they belong. and sensitive to the behaviors and beliefs of those around them. When members of a community begin to display certain symptoms, there is pressure, both conscious and unconscious, for others to conform to the emerging pattern. To remain unaffected while others suffer can create its own kind of stress, a sense of isolation, or even guilt. The affliction becomes a shared experience, a form of belonging, even as it also represents a form of suffering. The dancing plague of Strasbourg was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of similar outbreaks that occurred throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Dancing manias had been documented for centuries before 1518 and would continue to occur for some time afterward. These episodes varied in their details but shared common features: the involuntary nature of the movement, the apparent contagion from person to person, the concentration among certain demographic groups, and the eventual subsiding of symptoms, often in connection with religious intervention. One of the most famous of these earlier outbreaks occurred in 1374 in the town of Aachen, in what is now Germany. Hundreds of people danced through the streets, their movements accompanied by visions and hallucinations. They called out the names of demons and experienced what witnesses described as states of ecstatic possession. The outbreak eventually ended, but not before it had spread to neighboring communities and caused considerable disruption to normal life. The parallels with Strasbourg are striking, suggesting that both events may have shared underlying causes. The phenomenon known as tarantism, which flourished in southern Italy for several centuries, provides another point of comparison. In this tradition, people who had been bitten by tarantula spiders, or who believed themselves to have been bitten, experienced a compulsion to dance that could only be relieved through extended sessions of frantic movement, accompanied by specific musical rhythms. The tarantella dance that eventually became a folk tradition originated in these therapeutic sessions. While the spider bite provided a physical trigger, researchers have noted that many cases of tarantism occurred in people who had no actual encounter with spiders, suggesting that belief and suggestion played crucial roles. Moving beyond dancing, the history of mass psychogenic illness includes episodes involving many different symptoms. In 1962, a laughing epidemic broke out at a girls' school in Tanganyika, the modern nation of Tanzania. Students began laughing uncontrollably, the laughter spreading from person to person until the school had to be closed. The epidemic then spread to other schools and communities, eventually affecting over 1,000 people before finally subsiding after more than a year. No physical cause was ever identified. The victims were experiencing genuine distress, but the source of that distress lay in the social and psychological realm rather than in any pathogen or toxin. Medieval convents experienced their own distinctive forms of mass psychogenic illness. Nuns living in close quarters under strict discipline sometimes fell victim to outbreaks of strange behavior that spread through entire communities. In some cases, the affected women meowed like cats or bit one another. In other cases, they experienced convulsions or spoken voices not their own. These episodes were typically interpreted as cases of demonic possession. But modern researchers see in them the effects of psychological stress acting upon vulnerable individuals in closed social environments. What unites these diverse episodes across centuries and continents is the demonstration that the mind can produce physical symptoms of extraordinary intensity and persistence. The dancers of Strasbourg were not faking their affliction, were not choosing to move, were not able to stop through any act of will. Their bodies had been seized by something that felt like an external force, even if that force originated within their own psychology. The reality of their suffering is not diminished by identifying its source as mental rather than physical. The conditions that make communities vulnerable to mass psychogenic illness tend to recur throughout human history: economic hardship, social instability, exposure to threatening events, feelings of powerlessness, and strong shared beliefs create a fertile ground in which such outbreaks can take root. When people are stressed beyond their capacity to cope, and when they share a cultural framework that makes certain symptoms meaningful. The stage is set for the kind of collective experience that seized Strasbourg in 1518. The role of authority figures and institutional responses also proved significant in shaping the course of such outbreaks. In Strasbourg, the decision to encourage the dancing likely made the epidemic worse by validating the behavior and providing a context in which it was expected to continue. The construction of stages, the public attention focused on the dancers. All of these responses may have reinforced the psychological mechanisms driving the affliction. Conversely, the pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus provided a framework for recovery, a ritual through which the afflicted could transition back to normal behavior with the support of their community and their beliefs. Modern outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness are typically resolved much more quickly than historical ones, in part because authorities now understand the phenomenon and know how to respond, removing affected individuals from the environment where symptoms appeared, avoiding excessive attention to the symptoms, providing reassurance and support, and addressing underlying sources of stress can help break the cycle of suggestion and imitation that fuels such episodes. These interventions would have been unthinkable in 1518, when the very concept of psychological causation was foreign to the prevailing worldview. The mass psychogenic illness theory, like the ergot theory, cannot fully explain every feature of the dancing plague. It does not account for why the outbreak took the specific form of dancing rather than some other symptom. It does not fully explain the apparent randomness of who was affected and who was spared. It does not resolve the question of why Strasbourg experienced such an intense outbreak while neighboring communities did not. But it does offer a framework for understanding how psychological factors might have produced real physical symptoms in hundreds of people over a period of weeks. Perhaps most importantly, the mass psychogenic illness theory reminds us of the profound connection between mind and body, between social experience and individual health. The dancers of Strasbourg were not weak-willed or gullible. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, their bodies responding to pressures that exceeded their capacity for conscious resistance. Their affliction reveals something fundamental about human nature, the way our physical selves are shaped by our mental states, our social connections, and our cultural beliefs. The dancing plague stands as testimony to the power of the human mind to create realities that transcend individual experience. 400 people did not independently decide to dance themselves to exhaustion. Something spread among them, something that used their shared beliefs and their collective stress as pathways of transmission. Whether we call that something hysteria or psychogenic illness or mass suggestion, we are acknowledging that human beings are connected to one another in ways that go beyond physical contact. The suffering of one can become the suffering of many, and the beliefs of a community can manifest in the bodies of its members. More than 5 centuries have passed since the dancers of Strasbourg finally came to rest, yet their story continues to echo through the corridors of history. The dancing plague endures in our collective memory, not merely as a curious footnote from a distant era, but as something that speaks to fundamental questions about human nature. We return to this strange episode again and again because it illuminates corners of our existence that remain shadowed despite all the progress of science and reason. The mystery persists because the mystery matters, because it reveals truths about ourselves that we can approach in no other way. What draws us to this story is partly the sheer strangeness of it, the way it defies the categories through which we normally understand the world. Expect bodies to obey minds. Expect individuals to control their own movements. Expect physical symptoms to have physical causes. The dancing plague violates all of these expectations, presenting us with a phenomenon that seems to belong more to nightmare than to history. 400 people dancing against their will, unable to stop even as their feet bled and their hearts gave out. The image lodges in the imagination and refuses to leave. Yet strangeness alone does not account for the enduring fascination. History is full of strange events that have faded into obscurity, forgotten except by specialists. The dancing plague survives in popular awareness because it touches something deeper than mere curiosity. It speaks to fears that we carry within us still. Fears about the fragility of our control over our own bodies, about the power of social forces to overwhelm individual resistance, about the thin membrane that separates order from chaos in human affairs. Consider what it would mean to lose control of your body in the way that Frau Troffea and her fellow sufferers did. Imagine looking down at your own legs and watching them move without your permission, feeling your muscles contract in patterns you did not choose, being unable to stop no matter how desperately you willed yourself to stand still. This is a horror that strikes at the very foundation of selfhood, the assumption that we are masters of our own physical being. The dancing plague reminds us that this mastery is not absolute, that circumstances can arise in which the body rebels against the mind and wins. This vulnerability extends beyond the individual to encompass entire communities. The outbreak in Strasbourg was not a matter of isolated cases, but of hundreds of people seized by the same compulsion within a matter of weeks. Something moved through that population, something that used the channels of social connection as pathways of transmission. The dancers were not merely individuals suffering individual afflictions, but participants in a collective experience that transcended any single person. The social body had been infected along with the physical bodies of its members. The boundary between individual and collective, between self and society, proves more permeable than we often assume. We like to think of ourselves as autonomous beings, making choices based on our own reasoning and acting according to our own will. What the dancing plague reveals how deeply we are embedded in the groups to which we belong, how powerfully we are shaped by the beliefs and behaviors of those around us. Under certain conditions, the collective can reach inside us and move us in ways we neither choose nor understand. This insight carries uncomfortable implications for how we think about free will and personal responsibility. The dancers of Strasbourg did not choose their fate. They did not decide to dance, did not want to dance, desperately wished to stop dancing. Yet their bodies moved nonetheless, animated by forces that operated below the level of conscious decision. If our actions can be determined by influences outside our awareness and beyond our control, then what does it mean to say that we are free? The dancing plague poses this question with particular sharpness, and we have not yet found a fully satisfying answer. The response of the authorities in Strasbourg also carries lessons that remain relevant across the centuries. When faced with a crisis they did not understand, the city leaders turned to the experts of their day, the physicians who claimed knowledge of how bodies worked. These experts offered confident advice based on the theories they had learned, and the authorities followed that advice with disastrous results. The dancing cure made the outbreak worse, not better, demonstrating the dangers of misplaced confidence in the face of genuine uncertainty. We flatter ourselves that modern medicine has advanced far beyond the humoral theories that guided the physicians of 1518. And indeed, it has, in countless ways that have saved millions of lives. Yet, the fundamental challenge remains. It's the need to act in situations where our understanding is incomplete, where our theories may be wrong, where the confident advice of experts may lead us astray. The dancing plague stands as a reminder that expertise has limits, that the frontier between knowledge and ignorance is always closer than we think. The religious dimension of the outbreak also invites reflection from our temporal distance. The people of Strasbourg ultimately found relief not through medical intervention, but through pilgrimage and prayer, through rituals that modern science would dismiss as having no causal efficacy. Yet something happened at the shrine of Saint Vitus, something that enabled the dancers to stop dancing. Whether we attribute this outcome to genuine divine intervention, to the power of belief and suggestion, or to the natural course of the affliction, we cannot deny that the religious framework provided something that the medical framework did not. This observation need not lead us to abandon scientific reasoning in favor of supernatural explanations, but it might encourage a certain humility about the limits of materialist approaches to human suffering. The dancers were not simply biological machines malfunctioning. They were whole persons, beings whose physical symptoms were intertwined with their mental states, their social positions, their cultural beliefs. Any adequate response to their affliction had to address the whole person, not just the body in isolation. The shrine of Saint Vitus offered precisely this kind of holistic intervention, treating spirit and flesh as the integrated system they actually are. The dancing plague also reveals something about how societies process and remember collective trauma. The people of Strasbourg did not simply forget what had happened once the crisis passed. They recorded it in chronicles and civic documents, told stories about it to their children and grandchildren, incorporated it into their understanding of their community's history. The outbreak became part of the city's identity, a strange chapter that could not be erased or explained away. By remembering, they attempted to make meaning from meaninglessness, to integrate the inexplicable into a narrative that could be comprehended and survived. We do the same when we return to this story today, reading accounts and theories, watching documentaries and listening to podcasts about the dancing plague. We are not merely satisfying idle curiosity, but engaging in the fundamentally human work of meaning-making. We want to understand what happened in Strasbourg, because understanding is how we domesticate the terrifying, how we bring the wild forces of existence under some measure of intellectual control. Even when we cannot fully explain, we can at least describe, can categorize, can place the inexplicable event within a context that makes it feel less threatening. The mystery of the dancing plague resists final resolution, and perhaps that resistance is part of its enduring power. We can propose theories, can weigh evidence, can argue for one explanation over another, but we cannot achieve certainty. The event occurred too long ago. The records are too fragmentary. The phenomena too strange to fit neatly into any single framework. This irreducible uncertainty keeps the story alive, invites each generation to engage with it anew, to bring fresh perspectives and contemporary concerns to bear on an ancient puzzle. What we see when we look at the dancing plague depends partly on who we are and when we are looking. Medieval observers saw divine judgment and demonic possession. Enlightenment thinkers saw superstition and ignorance. Modern researchers see ergot, poisoning, or mass psychogenic illness. Each interpretation reflects the assumptions and preoccupations of its era. The questions that seem most pressing, the explanatory frameworks that seem most credible. The dancers themselves remain silent, their inner experiences lost to time, available only through the distorting lens of external observation. Perhaps the most honest response to the dancing plague is simply to sit with the mystery, to acknowledge that some things resist explanation, that the past contains events that will never be fully understood. This is not intellectual surrender, but intellectual maturity, the recognition that knowledge has limits and that wisdom lies partly in accepting those limits. The dancers of Strasbourg lived, suffered, and in many cases died, for reasons that remain beyond our capacity to fully comprehend. We honor them best, not by pretending to understand what we do not, but by bearing witness to their suffering across the centuries. The story of the dancing plague ultimately points toward the fundamental mystery of human existence itself. We are creatures who live in bodies we did not choose, shaped by forces we cannot see, connected to one another in ways we barely understand. We build civilizations and write histories. We develop sciences and compose philosophies. We create elaborate structures of meaning and control. And yet, beneath all of this lies a bedrock of uncertainty, a recognition that the world can produce phenomena that exceed our capacity to explain or predict. The dancers of Strasbourg encountered this bedrock in the most intimate way possible, through the rebellion of their own flesh. Their bodies became strangers to them, moving according to imperatives that their conscious minds could not access or override. This is perhaps the deepest horror of their story, not the physical suffering, though that was terrible enough, but the violation of the most basic assumption of embodied existence. They learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that we do not fully own ourselves, that the self we take for granted is more contingent and more vulnerable than we normally allow ourselves to believe. And yet they survived, most of them. The outbreak ended, the dancers recovered, the city returned to something like normal. Life went on, as it always does, incorporating even the strangest experiences into the ongoing flow of human existence. The people of Strasbourg did not emerge from their ordeal unchanged, but they did emerge. But they found ways to live with what had happened, to integrate it into their personal and collective stories, to move forward into a future that was uncertain but also full of possibility. This resilience offers its own kind of lesson, perhaps the most important one that the dancing plague has to teach. Human beings are vulnerable, profoundly so, to forces both within and without that can disrupt the order we depend upon. But we are also remarkably resilient, capable of surviving experiences that seem like they should be unsurvivable, capable of finding meaning even in the most meaningless seeming events. The dancers of Strasbourg were broken by their affliction, but they were not destroyed. Something in them, some core of selfhood and will, persisted through the ordeal and emerged on the other side. The summer of 1518 faded into autumn, and autumn into winter, and the years accumulated into decades and centuries. The people who had danced grew old and died, as all people do, Their children and grandchildren passed as well, carrying the stories with them into graves that have long since been forgotten. The city of Strasbourg changed and grew, weathered wars and revolutions, survived into our modern era as a place where ordinary people live ordinary lives. The stages where the dancers performed their involuntary spectacle have long since crumbled to dust. But the story remains, preserved in chronicles and archives, passed down through generations of scholars and storytellers, arriving at last in this moment where you receive it. The dancers of Strasbourg still dance in our imaginations, their feet still bleeding, their voices still crying out across the centuries. They remind us of what we are, creatures of flesh and spirit, bound to one another in ways we cannot fully comprehend, living always at the edge of mysteries we will never solve. Their dance has ended, but its echoes continue, and perhaps they always will.